poet wakes trembling, his masterpiece finished, and his strength is almost gone. Across centuries, artists whispered of a muse who gifted brilliance but left them hollow, a presence so intoxicating it felt divine. Was it love, madness, or something that fed on their very souls? This is the story of the Leannán Sídhe, Celtic's vampire muse who drains artists dry. Let's start with the name itself, Leannán Sídhe. You pronounce it something like Leannán Sídhe, and it rolls off the tongue with a strange music all its own. The first word, Leannán, means lover in Irish Gaelic. Not just any lover, but the kind tied to deep affection, the kind that binds hearts together. The second word, Sídhe, is where things get interesting. Sídhe refers to the supernatural beings of Irish folklore, the fairy folk who exist just beyond the edge of our everyday world. Put them together and you get fairy lover, a being who offers affection from the other world itself. But this isn't your typical fairy tale romance. The Leannán Sídhe represents something far more complex, something that speaks to the very heart of what it means to create art. She's a figure who embodies both the ecstasy and the agony of inspiration, the muse who gives everything and demands everything in return. So where does this legend actually come from? Let's break this into three clear areas: the linguistic roots, the cultural context, and the literary evolution. First, the linguistic roots. Irish Gaelic is an ancient language, one of the oldest in Europe still spoken today. When you dig into the words themselves, you find layers of meaning that go deeper than simple translation. The word Sídhe doesn't just mean fairy in some generic sense. It's directly connected to the Tuatha De Danann, the legendary race of deities who once ruled Ireland in myth. These weren't cute tiny fairies with butterfly wings. They were powerful, otherworldly beings with magic that could reshape reality itself. According to the old stories, when human settlers arrived in Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann retreated underground into the hollow hills and ancient burial mounds. They became the Aur Sídhe, the people of the mounds, living in a parallel realm that occasionally touched our own. Now let's look at the cultural context. Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries was a place where the old stories still mattered. People still believed in the good folk, the gentry, the fair ones. They had 100 different names for the fairies because speaking the real name might draw unwanted attention. Villagers knew which hills to avoid at twilight. Farmers left offerings of milk and bread at the doorstep. And within this living tradition of belief, certain fairy types stood out as especially dangerous. Leannán Sídhe was one of them. Unlike the helpful house brownies or the mischievous pukas, she was associated with a very specific kind of peril. The slow drain of life itself through the channel of creative passion. The third piece is literary evolution. For centuries, the Leannán Sídhe existed primarily in oral tradition. Stories were passed from grandparent to grandchild, told around peat fires on winter nights, whispered as warnings to young poets who seemed too consumed by their work. But in the late 1800s, something changed. Scholars and writers began collecting these oral tales, writing them down, analysing them. Douglas Hyde, one of the founders of the Gaelic League, translated numerous folk tales from Irish into English. William Butler Yeats, who would become one of Ireland's most celebrated poets, included tales of Leannán Sídhe in his collections of Irish folklore. Yeats saw something profound in this myth. He recognized it as more than just a spooky story. He understood it as a metaphor for the creative process itself. Consider how this legend functioned in its original context. Imagine a small Irish village in 1850. There's a young man there, exceptionally talented, writing poetry that makes people weep and laugh in equal measure. But he's also wasting away. He barely eats. He doesn't sleep. He seems possessed by something none of the others can see. The older generation looks at him and whispers, "Leannán Sídhe has him. She's given him the gift, and now she's taking her payment." This explanation did several things at once. It acknowledged the young man's extraordinary talent. It provided a reason for his suffering. It warned others about the danger of becoming too obsessed with creative work. The genius of the myth lies in how it captures a genuine paradox. True creative inspiration often does feel like it comes from outside yourself, like you're channeling something beyond your normal consciousness. Artists throughout history have described moments when the work seems to flow through them rather than from them. But that same state of creative possession can be genuinely destructive. It can lead to neglecting physical health, ignoring relationships, burning out emotionally and mentally. Leannán Sídhe gives this experience a face and a name. Yeats described her as giving inspiration to those she loves, but her love was fatal. Those she chose would create work of stunning beauty and power, but they would also die young, consumed by the very gift she had given them. This wasn't presented as evil or malicious. It was simply her nature, the way a flame gives light but also burns. The legend also merged psychological insight with supernatural storytelling in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Long before anyone talked about burnout or creative exhaustion in clinical terms, the Irish were telling stories about a fairy who drained the life force of artists through their own passion. It's folklore doing the work of psychology, providing a framework for understanding self-destructive patterns without the vocabulary of modern medicine. As we move forward, we'll explore the world this mysterious lover came from, the other world of Celtic belief, where the rules are different and beauty can kill. Last time we met the Leannán Sídhe by name. Now we need to understand the strange realm she calls home. Think of the Celtic otherworld as a parallel dimension that exists right alongside our everyday reality, not above it like heaven, not below it like hell, but beside it, separated by the thinnest of veils. The Irish called it many names: Tir na Nog, the land of youth; Magmel, the pleasant plain; Tir Tangia, the land of promise. Each name emphasized a different quality of this mysterious place, but they all pointed to the same fundamental idea. Somewhere beyond normal perception, there exists a realm where time moves differently, where beauty is more intense, where magic is simply how things work. How did people believe you could reach this other world? Let's explore three primary gateways: the ancient mounds, the liminal times, and the sacred landscapes. First, the ancient mounds. Scattered across the Irish countryside, you'll find hundreds of prehistoric burial mounds and hill forts. These aren't just archaeological sites. To the people who lived near them, they were doorways. The most famous is Newgrange, a massive stone structure older than the Egyptian pyramids. But there were countless smaller mounds too, each one potentially housing an entrance to the other world. The Irish word for these mounds is sea, which is also the root of Sídhe. The connection isn't coincidental. These mounds were believed to be the actual homes of the fairy folk. Disturbing a fairy mound, building on one, or even walking too close at the wrong time could be incredibly dangerous. Second, the liminal times. The Celts understood that certain moments exist on the boundary between one state and another, and these threshold times were when the veil between worlds grew thin. Twilight, the space between day and night. Midnight, the transition between one day and the next. But the most powerful liminal time was Samhain, the festival we now call Halloween, marking the boundary between the light half of the year and the dark half. On Samhain night, the dead could walk among the living, and the Sídhe could move freely in the human world. Third, the sacred landscapes. Certain natural features were understood as places where the other world pressed close to our own. Lakes with no visible bottom, caves that seemed to lead into the heart of the earth, ancient standing stones arranged in circles, crossroads where multiple paths met. These weren't just pretty or unusual spots. They were places of genuine spiritual significance. A person who fell asleep beside a fairy ring of mushrooms might wake up years later, thinking only a single night had passed. Now let's talk about who actually lived in this other world. The Tuatha De Danann were the original inhabitants according to myth. Their name means the people of the goddess Danu, and they were described as a race of gods, or godlike beings who came to Ireland in ancient times. They possessed incredible magic, superior weapons, and the power to control weather, fertility, and fate itself. For a time, they ruled Ireland completely. But then came the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish, and after a great battle, the Tuatha De Danann were defeated. They didn't leave Ireland entirely, though. Instead, they retreated into the hollow hills, into the other world. From that point forward, they became the Sídhe, the people of the mounds. This transformation is crucial to understanding Leannán Sídhe. She wasn't some minor nature spirit. She was descended from the ancient gods themselves, carrying divine power even in her diminished form. When she appeared to a mortal artist, it was a genuine encounter with the divine, or at least with something very close to it. The Sídhe were often described as living in elaborate courts beneath the hills, with their own kings and queens, their own hierarchies. They feasted on supernatural food that never ran out. They danced to music so beautiful it could drive a mortal mad with longing. Time moved strangely in their realm. A single night in the other world might equal years in the human world, or vice versa. Consider what happens when these two worlds touch. A young musician walks home at twilight, his mind full of a melody he's been working on. He passes near an old mound. Tonight is different. Tonight the veil is thin. He hears music coming from beneath the hill, music more beautiful than anything he's ever imagined. He stops, he listens, and in that moment of attention, he becomes visible to those on the other side. Leannán Sídhe sees him. She's drawn to his creative fire. She reaches across the boundary and offers him a gift, the ability to create music that will make him immortal. He accepts without understanding the price. The Sídhe weren't uniformly malevolent, but they were consistently dangerous. They operated by different rules, different ethics than humans. What seemed like a generous gift from their perspective might destroy a human life. Leannán Sídhe exemplified this fundamental incompatibility. She genuinely offered inspiration, genuinely gave the gift she promised. but her nature and human nature simply couldn't coexist without damage. Some folklore classified her specifically among the solitary fairies rather than the trooping fairies who travelled in groups. Solitary fairies were generally more dangerous, more unpredictable. They acted alone, which meant they had no community to moderate their behaviour. Leannán Sídhe chose her victims individually, pursued them personally, and consumed them in isolation. Once she fixed her attention on you, you were alone with a supernatural force that wanted something from you that you couldn't really afford to give. Next, we'll meet Leannán Sídhe directly and discover exactly how she hunts, what she offers, and what terrible bargain lies beneath her gift. We've explored her name and her world. Now it's time to look directly at Leannán Sídhe herself. Picture this. You're an artist struggling with your work, lying awake night after night with ideas that won't quite take shape. Then one evening, as twilight settles, you see her. She's young, impossibly beautiful, with features so perfect they almost hurt to look at. She might wear white like moonlight, or green like deep forest shade, or red like heart's blood. Her beauty isn't the pleasant attractiveness of a human woman. It's something more intense, more alien, more compelling. You can't look away, and in her eyes, you see something that terrifies and thrills you. She sees your potential. This is how she typically appears. Leannán Sídhe manifests as a young woman of otherworldly beauty, and that beauty is deliberate. It's a lure, yes, but it's also a reflection of what she represents, the perfection that artists chase. When you look at her, you're looking at the embodiment of everything your art is trying to capture. Let's break down her modus operandi into 3 distinct phases: the approach, the offering, and the consumption. The approach phase is surprisingly selective. The Leannán Sídhe doesn't appear to just anyone. She's drawn to specific individuals, poets, artists, musicians, those whose souls burn with creative fire. She can sense passion, apparently, the way a shark senses blood in water. If you're someone who lives for your art, who feels things more intensely than others, who channels emotion into creative work, you're exactly the kind of person who might attract her attention. She watches first, studying her potential victim. She appears in dreams before she appears in waking life. You might find yourself haunted by visions of incredible beauty, by ideas for works of art that seem to come from outside yourself. Then comes the offering phase. Once she's certain of her target, she reveals herself more directly. She might appear at twilight near your home. She might manifest during a moment of deep creative frustration. She speaks, and her voice is like music. She tells you that she loves you, that she sees your genius, that she wants to give you a gift. And the gift she offers is genuine. Inspiration beyond anything you've experienced before. The ability to create works of stunning power and beauty. Recognition. Immortality through art. She doesn't lie about this. The gift is real. Artists who accept her offer do create magnificent work. But here's where we reach the consumption phase. The inspiration she gives has a source, and that source is you. She's not channeling energy from some external reservoir of creativity. She's unlocking your own life force and burning it as fuel for your art. The more you create, the weaker you become. Your health deteriorates. Sleep becomes impossible. You grow thin, pale, feverish. Your mind races constantly with ideas, giving you no peace. Friends watch you waste away even as you're work becomes more brilliant, and you can't stop. Some traditions describe this process more explicitly. They say she feeds on emotion, on creative energy, on the vital force that animates human life. She's not drinking blood like a vampire in the conventional sense, but she's draining something equally essential. Think of it like a battery being drained. Every masterpiece you create draws down your reserves a little more. Every inspired moment costs you hours or days of life. And here's a crucial detail. She often appears in dreams and visions rather than purely physical form. This suggests that her domain is psychological as much as supernatural. She exists in the liminal space between inspiration and obsession, between creative flow and destructive compulsion. When you're deep in the grip of creative fever, unable to stop working, when is that healthy passion, and when has it crossed into something harmful? Leannán Sídhe lives in that ambiguous zone. Consider how this would play out. An artist accepts her gift, not fully understanding the terms. For the first weeks, it's glorious. Ideas flow like water. The work comes easily, brilliantly. Recognition follows. But then the artist starts to notice problems. They're tired all the time. They've lost weight. They can't focus on anything except their work. Relationships suffer. Physical health declines. The work demands everything, and they give it everything, because not creating is even more unbearable than the exhaustion. The end comes inevitably. The artist dies young, burned out like a candle flame. They leave behind a body of work that seems impossible for such a short life. People marvel at how much they accomplished, how brilliant it was, how tragic that they died so young. And in the old Irish villages, the elders would nod knowingly. The Leannán Sídhe had them. What makes this myth so enduring is how closely it mirrors actual patterns in creative lives. History is full of artists who produced incredible work during periods of intense productivity and then crashed. The Leannán Sídhe provides a narrative framework for understanding these patterns. She's the face we put on creative self-destruction. Her lovers, according to tradition, often die young, but leave remarkable legacies. The trade-off is explicit: brief life, lasting art. It's a deal that some artists, if they truly understood the terms, might actually accept. What's a few decades of ordinary life compared to creating something that will outlive you by centuries? Now we'll trace how this raw folklore became literature, how scholars and poets transformed this frightening fairy tale into a symbol that still resonates today. We've seen the Leannán Sídhe in her original form. But something fascinating happens when folklore meets literature, when stories told around fires get written down and reimagined. For centuries, the Leannán Sídhe existed primarily in the spoken word. Grandmothers told their grandchildren. Village storytellers held audiences spellbound on long winter nights. The stories shifted slightly with each telling, but the core remained consistent. A beautiful, dangerous fairy who inspired artists and drained their lives. So what changed in the late 1800s? Let's explore three catalysts: the folklore revival, the scholars who collected these tales, and the poets who made them famous. The folklore revival happened across Europe during the 19th century, but it had special intensity in Ireland. This was a time when Irish culture was under threat. The English had banned the Irish language in schools. Traditional ways of life were disappearing. Many educated Irish people felt a desperate need to preserve what remained before it vanished completely. Collecting folklore became an act of cultural preservation and political resistance. Into this context stepped scholars like Douglas Hyde. Hyde was Protestant by birth, but deeply devoted to Irish Catholic culture. He learned Irish fluently, travelled the countryside collecting stories directly from Irish speakers, and worked tirelessly to preserve the language. He co-founded the Gaelic League. His translations brought stories like the Leannán Sídhe to audiences who couldn't read the original Irish. But the figure who really brought Leannán Sídhe into literary prominence was William Butler Yeats. Yeats is now recognised as one of the greatest poets in the English language, winner of the Nobel Prize. But in the 1880s, he was a young man obsessed with Irish folklore and mysticism, searching for something that would make his poetry distinctly Irish. Yeats included tales of the Leannán Sídhe in his collection Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, published in 1888. He described Leannán Sídhe as the fairy mistress who gives inspiration to the poets she loves. He saw her as fundamentally similar to the Greek Muses, but with a darker edge. The Muses inspired without destroying. The Leannán Sídhe inspired through destruction. In his later work, The Celtic Twilight, published in 1893, Yeats called her a muse-like vampire, a phrase that perfectly captures the paradox. She's nurturing and predatory simultaneously. She gives genuine gifts, but demands an unbearable price. Yeats understood that this wasn't just a scary story. It was a profound meditation on creativity itself. Consider how Yeats was positioned to understand this myth. He was himself driven to create, often at great personal cost. He suffered from unrequited love for Maud Gonne, channeling that suffering into beautiful poetry. He understood obsession. He understood how desire could fuel art. When he wrote about Leannán Sídhe, he was writing about something he recognized in himself. The comparison to Greek muses was deliberate. In classical mythology, the 9 muses were daughters of Zeus, who inspired artists in different domains. They were benevolent, offering their gifts freely. The relationship was reciprocal and positive. Leannán Sídhe inverts this. Her inspiration comes at a cost. She's not helping artists out of generosity. She's feeding on them. Through Yeats and other writers of the Irish literary revival, the Leannán Sídhe became more than folklore. She became a symbol, a way of talking about the creative process and its dangers. Other poets picked up the image. She began appearing as a representation of toxic inspiration, of creative obsession. The legend influenced Gothic literature and symbolist poetry. These movements were already fascinated with beauty, death, and the supernatural. The Leannán Sídhe fit perfectly. She embodied the dark romanticism of late 19th century art, the idea that beauty and death were intimately connected, that the most intense experiences came with the highest prices. Consider how this evolution changes the myth's function. In oral tradition, the Leannán Sídhe was a warning, but in literary tradition, she became something artists could use to explore their own relationships with their work. When a poet invoked the Leannán Sídhe, they were making a statement about creativity itself. The myth became self-aware. Artists who knew the legend could recognize its patterns in their own lives. They could joke darkly about being pursued by the Leannán Sídhe when they felt consumed by their work. This is folklore evolving to meet new needs, staying relevant by adapting to changing contexts. Next, we'll meet some real artists who became linked to this myth, whose lives seem to embody the pattern she represents. Myths become powerful when they connect to real lives. Leannán Sídhe stopped being just a story when people started recognizing her pattern in actual artists' fates. One name appears repeatedly: James Clarence Mangan. If you're not familiar with Irish poetry, you might not know him, but in his time, Mangan was significant. He lived from 1803 to 1849. He wrote poetry that was dark, beautiful, melancholic, haunted by themes of doomed love and inescapable fate. And his life embodied every aspect of the Leannán Sídhe curse. Let's look closely at Mangan's trajectory. He was born into poverty in Dublin. His father was abusive. His childhood was difficult, but he had extraordinary talent with language. He could read and write in multiple languages. His poetry had a quality of intensity that set it apart. He wrote as if something inside him was burning. Early in his career, Mangan worked as a lawyer's clerk to support himself. He wrote poetry in his spare time. His work gained recognition. But something was happening to him personally. He became increasingly isolated. He developed problems with alcohol and opium. His health deteriorated. Friends described him as looking like a ghost, consumed by something they couldn't see. The themes in his poetry are remarkably consistent with the Leannán Sídhe myth. He wrote again and again about love that destroys, about beauty that kills, about doomed passion. In his poem Dark Rosaleen, he addresses Ireland itself as a dark beloved, a dangerous beauty worth dying for. His work is saturated with inevitable tragedy. Mangan's final years were in a steady decline. He became increasingly addicted. He could barely support himself. He looked like a walking corpse, according to descriptions, but he kept writing. Even as his body failed, his creative drive persisted. In 1849, during the Great Famine, Mangan contracted cholera. He was already so weakened that he had no resources left to fight. He died in poverty alone at just 46 years old. After his death, Mangan's reputation grew. People recognized the brilliance of his work, and inevitably, people connected his story to the old myths. He had the gift, they said. Leannán Sídhe had chosen him. His poetry was too intense to come from normal inspiration. Now, there's no evidence Mangan believed in Leannán Sídhe. The connection was made posthumously by others looking for ways to understand his tragic life. But that's precisely what makes this linkage interesting. The myth provided a narrative framework that made sense of a pattern people kept seeing. Exceptional talent combined with self-destructive behavior leading to early death. Other Irish writers of the period showed similar patterns. Thomas Crofton Croker collected fairy legends that included stories of supernatural lovers who brought inspiration and doom. Women writers like Ethna Carberry and Catherine Tynan incorporated imagery of dangerous fairy muses into their poetry. The Leannán Sídhe became a recognized symbol in Irish literary culture. During Ireland's cultural revival in the late 1800s, this myth took on additional layers. Ireland itself was sometimes portrayed as a dark, demanding lover who inspired artists but also destroyed them. The cause of Irish independence was beautiful, worthy, essential, but it demanded everything from those who devoted themselves to it. Revolutionary poets died young. Cultural activists burned themselves out. Leannán Sídhe became a metaphor not just for art, but for political passion. Consider how this works psychologically. When you know the myth, you start recognizing its pattern everywhere. An artist dies young after intense productivity. That's Leannán Sídhe. A poet becomes addicted while creating their best work. That's Leannán Sídhe. The myth becomes a lens through which to view creative suffering. The legend provided comfort in a strange way. If your friend or family member was destroying themselves through their art, at least there was a story that explained it, a tradition that recognized it. Leannán Sídhe gave people a way to talk about something that was otherwise almost unspeakable. The fact that sometimes the things we love most are also the things that destroy us. Next, we'll place Leannán Sídhe alongside similar figures from other European traditions and see what patterns emerge. The Leannán Sídhe isn't alone in the landscape of European folklore. Across the continent, culture after culture told stories about beautiful, dangerous spirits who combine seduction with death. What does it mean that so many different peoples arrived at similar myths? Let's examine 5 parallel figures from different traditions and see what patterns emerge. The Greek Muses, the Slavic Rusalka, the French Dame Blanche, the Scottish Balban Sith, and what they all share. First, the Greek Muses. These 9 daughters of Zeus each presided over different artistic domains: epic poetry, lyric poetry, music, dance, comedy, tragedy, history, astronomy, and sacred hymn. They were benevolent divine beings who inspired mortals when properly honored. A poet would invoke a muse at the beginning of their work, asking for inspiration. The muse would grant it freely. There was no dark bargain, no terrible price. The relationship was reciprocal and positive. You honored the muses with offerings and respect. They blessed you with inspiration. This is almost the opposite of the Leannán Sídhe. The muses represent inspiration as pure gift, while the Leannán Sídhe represents inspiration as transaction with terrible terms. Now consider the Slavic Rusalka. These are water spirits, usually female, often the spirits of women who died by drowning. They're beautiful, seductive, and deadly. They appear near rivers, lakes, and streams, luring men with their beauty and their singing. Men who approach them might be dragged under the water to drown, or dance to death, or simply die of longing. The Rusalka shares Leannán Sídhe's combination of beauty and fatal danger. Both use attraction as a weapon. Both promise something transcendent, but deliver death. The key difference is that the Rusalka doesn't offer any genuine gift. She's purely predatory, while Leannán Sídhe actually gives inspiration before taking life. The French Dame Blanche, or White Lady, appears in various forms across French folklore. She's typically a pale female apparition who appears near crossroads, bridges, or other threshold places. She tests travelers, sometimes offering help, sometimes demanding tribute, sometimes simply appearing as an omen. Some versions portray her as benevolent, others as dangerous. She's associated with nobility, often said to be the ghost of a noblewoman who died tragically. The Dame Blanche shares Leannán Sídhe's liminal quality, appearing at boundaries and transitions, but she's more diverse in her behavior and less specifically focused on artists. The Scottish Balban Sith is perhaps the closest parallel to the Leannán Sídhe. She appears in Highland folklore as a female vampire who disguises herself as a beautiful woman, often dressed in green. She and her sisters appeared to travellers, especially young men, and offered to dance with them. During the dance, they drained their victims' blood and life force. The Balban Sith actively hunts. like the Leannán Sídhe. Both are specifically female supernatural beings who combine beauty with vampiric feeding. The main difference is that the Leannán Sídhe offers entertainment and companionship rather than creative inspiration, and she acts more openly violent, actually drinking blood rather than draining life force gradually. What do all these figures share? Let's identify three common elements: the fatal feminine archetype, the theme of transaction and cost, and the connection between beauty and danger. The fatal feminine archetype appears across European folklore with remarkable consistency. These aren't just dangerous women, they're supernatural beings who embody a specific kind of threat: seduction leading to destruction. They're beautiful because beauty is the lure. They're feminine because these stories were largely shaped by male perspectives and fears. They represent anxieties about female power, about sexual desire, about losing control. But they also represent something deeper: the recognition that the things we desire most intensely can be the things that destroy us. The theme of transaction and cost runs through many of these myths. Leannán Sídhe offers inspiration for life. The Rusalka offers beauty and song for drowning. Even the Muses, in their benevolent form, require proper respect and offerings. European folklore is full of this transactional thinking. Nothing comes free. Every gift has a price. Supernatural beings operate by contracts we might not fully understand. The connection between beauty and danger is perhaps the most universal element. All these figures are described as beautiful, often impossibly so. Their beauty isn't incidental, it's central to their function. Beauty attracts, compels, makes us lower our guard. In these myths, beauty becomes a kind of trap, a way of getting close enough to cause harm. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. We're drawn to beauty even when we know or suspect it's dangerous. Consider why these similar myths appear across different cultures. One possibility is simple cultural transmission. Stories travel with traders, invaders, migrants. A myth from one culture can influence another. But there's also the possibility of parallel development. If human psychology is similar across cultures, and if similar fears and desires exist everywhere, then similar stories might naturally emerge to express those fears and desires. The Leannán Sídhe stands out in this company for one specific reason. She's uniquely focused on the creative process. The Rusalka just kills. The Dame Blanche tests or haunts. The Leannán Sídhe hunts for blood. But the Leannán Sídhe specifically targets artists and offers them the one thing they want most: the ability to create work that will outlive them. This makes her myth particularly sophisticated. She's not just about the danger of female sexuality or the perils of the supernatural. She's about the specific danger of creative obsession, of sacrificing everything for art. This comparative view helps us understand what's universal about Leannán Sídhe and what's specifically Celtic or Irish about her. The beautiful, dangerous female spirit is universal. The connection to artistic inspiration is her unique contribution to this archetype. Next, we'll dig deeper into what Leannán Sídhe actually represents, the symbolic and psychological dimensions that make this more than just a scary story. We've met Leannán Sídhe, explored her world, and seen her echoes in other myths. Now it's time to ask, what does she really mean? What deeper truths hide beneath this story of a fairy who loves artists to death? Let's unpack the symbolism through three lenses: the nature of inspiration, cultural fears and values, and psychological insights. First, let's talk about inspiration itself. The Leannán Sídhe represents the dual nature of creative drive. It's both a blessing and a curse, both a gift and burden. This isn't metaphorical exaggeration. Ask any serious artist about the creative process, and you'll hear this paradox repeated again and again. When inspiration strikes, it feels wonderful and terrible simultaneously. Wonderful because you're finally creating, finally channeling what you've been trying to express. Terrible because it demands everything from you, allows you no rest, consumes all your attention and energy. The myth captures this with brilliant precision. Leannán Sídhe gives genuine inspiration. Her gift works. Artists who accept it create magnificent work. But the inspiration doesn't come from some external wellspring of creativity. It comes from burning their own life force as fuel. This is actually how creative work functions psychologically. You're not channeling some external muse. You're drawing on your own emotional reserves, your own experiences, your own capacity to feel and observe deeply. Extended periods of intense creative work genuinely do drain people emotionally and physically. Leannán Sídhe is making this internal process external and visible. She also represents a seductive nature of creative obsession. Once you've experienced that state of flow, that feeling of creating something truly good, you want it again. You'll sacrifice a lot to get back to that state. You'll skip meals, lose sleep, ignore relationships, push your body and mind past healthy limits. The obsession feels justified because the work is so important, so necessary. Leannán Sídhe embodies this justification. She makes the bargain explicit. Your art for your life. And the terrifying thing is that some artists, if offered that deal clearly, would take it. Now let's examine the cultural fears embedded in this myth. The Leannán Sídhe reflects 19th century Irish anxieties about female power and sexuality. She's beautiful, seductive, and completely autonomous. She chooses her victims. She takes what she wants. She operates outside male control. In a patriarchal society, this kind of feminine power is frightening. The myth allows that fear to be expressed and contained. The dangerous woman is literally supernatural, not human, which makes her both more frightening and more manageable as a symbol. But there's also a fear of losing control more generally. The artists the Leannán Sídhe chooses become possessed by their work, unable to stop creating even as it kills them. This reflects cultural anxiety about obsession, about passion that overrides reason and self-preservation. Irish culture valued community, family, practical concerns. Someone consumed by individual creative drive, ignoring all else, represented a kind of social threat. The myth provides a framework for understanding and warning against this. The Leannán Sídhe also embodies the romantic ideal of the tormented genius that was so powerful in 19th century culture. This was the era of romantic poetry and art, when suffering was seen as almost essential to great creativity. Real artists were supposed to feel more deeply, suffer more intensely, burn brighter, and die younger than ordinary people. Leannán Sídhe literalizes this ideal. She's the personification of romantic suffering as creative fuel. Now for the psychological interpretation, which is perhaps the most relevant for modern understanding. The Leannán Sídhe can be read as a metaphor for mental illness, particularly mood disorders that affect creative individuals. Studies have shown that creative people have higher rates of bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety than the general population. The manic phases of bipolar disorder, in particular, can produce bursts of incredible productivity and creativity, followed by crashes into depression and exhaustion. This pattern mirrors Leannán Sídhe's curse almost exactly. Periods of brilliant creation powered by something that feels beyond your control, followed by devastating physical and mental decline. The myth also speaks to addiction. Many artists have turned to alcohol, drugs, or other substances to fuel their creativity or cope with the emotional intensity of their work. These substances can seem to enhance creativity in the short term, making ideas flow more freely, lowering inhibitions. But they destroy health, relationships, and eventually the ability to create at all. Leannán Sídhe's relationship with her victims follows this exact trajectory. She offers enhanced ability that feels transcendent and necessary, but she's actually draining the person's vitality. Addiction wrapped in beautiful, seductive packaging. Modern psychology recognizes burnout as a genuine phenomenon, particularly in high-intensity creative fields. Burnout happens when you push yourself too hard for too long, when you don't allow time for rest and recovery, when you treat yourself as an infinite resource. The symptoms include exhaustion, cynicism, reduced effectiveness, and health problems. Sound familiar? The Leannán Sídhe is burnout personified, the supernatural embodiment of what happens when creative drive becomes destructive compulsion. Consider the concept of flow state, identified by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Flow is that wonderful condition where you're completely absorbed in your work, time seems to disappear, and creation feels effortless. It's associated with dopamine release in the brain, which feels rewarding and can become genuinely addictive. Creative people chase flow because it's when they do their best work and feel most alive. But pursuing flow obsessively, without balance, leads to the same problems the Leannán Sídhe represents: neglecting physical needs, damaging relationships, burning out. The myth gave people a way to talk about this pattern centuries before neuroscience could explain the mechanisms. The Leannán Sídhe also represents the internal conflict many artists feel between creating and living. There's a sense, sometimes, that time spent not creating is time wasted, that ordinary life activities are obstacles to real work. This mindset leads to neglecting health, relationships, and basic self-care. The artist becomes isolated, consumed by their work. Leannán Sídhe externalizes this internal pressure. She's the voice that says, "Keep working. This is what matters. Sacrifice everything else." Here's something fascinating. The myth provided a supernatural explanation for patterns that we now understand through psychology and neuroscience. But the myth's explanation isn't wrong exactly. It's a different kind of truth, saying the Leannán Sídhe has him, and saying he's experiencing creative mania leading to burnout. Describe the same phenomenon from different frameworks. Both acknowledge the pattern. Both recognize the danger. Both understand that inspiration and destruction can be intertwined. The enduring power of the myth suggests it captures something that pure clinical description misses: the experiential reality of creative obsession. When you're in the grip of it, it does feel like possession. It does feel like something outside yourself has taken control. Describing it as a beautiful, supernatural being who loves you and is killing you captures the emotional truth more completely than diagnostic criteria. Leannán Sídhe asks a question that remains relevant. What is art worth? What should you be willing to sacrifice for creative achievement? Is immortality through art a fair trade for years of life? The myth doesn't answer these questions definitively. Instead, it holds them up, makes them visible, and forces us to confront them. Next, we'll jump forward to the present and see how this ancient myth continues to appear in modern media, literature, and popular culture. The Leannán Sídhe didn't stay buried in 19th century folklore collections. She's alive and well in modern culture, appearing in novels, games, music, and art, adapting to new contexts, while keeping her essential nature. Let's trace her modern journey through three categories: literature and popular fiction, gaming and interactive media, and artistic interpretations. First, modern fantasy literature has embraced Leannán Sídhe enthusiastically. In Melissa Marr's Wicked Lovely series, fairies walk among modern teenagers, and the old rules still apply. The series draws heavily on Celtic mythology, including dangerous fairy lovers. Holly Black's The Cruel Prince and related books feature fae courts, where beauty masks cruelty, and inspiration comes at terrible costs. Julie Kagawa's Iron Fae series includes numerous Celtic fairy beings, adapting them to a world where iron and technology threaten fairy existence. These books introduce Leannán Sídhe to young adult audiences, making her relevant to a generation that might never have encountered Irish folklore otherwise. What's interesting is how these modern versions handle the myth. Sometimes authors keep her traditional form, a beautiful fairy who offers inspiration in exchange for life. Other times, they reimagine her more metaphorically, creating characters who embody the same pattern without being literally the Leannán Sídhe. A mentor who pushes a young artist too hard. A lover who inspires brilliant work but demands everything. A supernatural being who feeds on creativity itself. The core pattern remains recognizable even when the details change. Urban fantasy in particular has found Leannán Sídhe useful. These are stories set in the modern world, but where magic still exists, hidden in the shadows. Leannán Sídhe fits perfectly into this genre. She can walk city streets at night, appearing to struggling artists in coffee shops and studios. She represents the timeless danger of creative obsession in a contemporary setting. The contrast between ancient fairy and modern world creates interesting storytelling opportunities. Now let's talk about gaming. Role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons have incorporated the Leannán Sídhe into their bestiaries. In these games, she's typically classified as a fae creature, beautiful and dangerous, who can charm and drain life force. Players might encounter her as a quest giver, offering inspiration in exchange for service, or as an antagonist who has already claimed several artists' lives. The gaming context makes the transactional nature of her myth explicit. She offers specific mechanical benefits in exchange for specific costs. Video games have also discovered the Leannán Sídhe. Games that draw on Celtic mythology, like the Witcher series or various indie titles, include fairy beings that echo her characteristics. The visual medium allows game designers to emphasize her otherworldly beauty, creating stunning character designs that make her appeal understandable while keeping her clearly inhuman and dangerous. In tabletop role-playing, the Leannán Sídhe has become a template for creating complex non-player characters. She's not simply evil, she genuinely offers something valuable. Players have to decide whether the gift is worth the price. This creates moral ambiguity and interesting decision points. Good game design, like good folklore, makes you think seriously about choices and consequences. Irish music has kept Leannán Sídhe alive in a different way. Traditional musicians and contemporary Irish artists reference her in songs, using her as a symbol for lost love, dangerous inspiration, or the costs of art. Folk bands incorporate her into concept albums about Celtic mythology. She appears in lyrics as a metaphor for toxic relationships or addictive creative processes. The musical tradition keeps her rooted in Irish culture, while also introducing her to international audiences who encounter Irish music. Visual artists have found Leannán Sídhe an irresistible subject. She's been painted, sculpted, photographed, and digitally rendered countless times. Artists are drawn to the challenge of depicting unearthly beauty, of capturing something that's supposed to be so compelling it destroys people. There's an irony here. Artists creating art about a being who destroys artists through art. Some artists acknowledge this explicitly, treating the Leannán Sídhe as a self-portrait or confession about their own relationship with their work. Contemporary poetry continues to reference Leannán Sídhe, particularly among Irish and Irish-American poets. She appears in poems about creative struggle, about the cost of making art in a world that often doesn't value it, about burnout and exhaustion. Modern poets use her the same way Yeats did, as a way to talk about the dark side of inspiration without reducing it to clinical terminology. Film has been slower to embrace the Leannán Sídhe specifically, though plenty of movies feature characters who embody similar patterns. The dangerous muse who inspires and destroys appears in films about artists, though she's rarely identified by her Irish name. This might be because visual media requires more explanation, and the Leannán Sídhe works best when audiences already understand the reference. In novels and poetry, you can assume readers know the myth, or provide quick context. In film, it's harder to balance explanation with narrative momentum. Folklore studies and academic circles have kept serious attention on the Leannán Sídhe. She appears in books about fairy folklore, about Celtic mythology, about the psychology of creativity. Scholars analyze what she reveals about gender, power, creativity, and cultural values. Academic conferences on folklore regularly include papers examining her myth and its modern interpretations. The myth persists because it remains relevant. Creative burnout hasn't disappeared. Artists still struggle with the balance between dedication and self-destruction. The pressure to create constantly in the social media age has only intensified. Leannán Sídhe gives us a way to talk about these ongoing issues through story and symbolism. One interesting modern interpretation treats the Leannán Sídhe as a metaphor for toxic inspiration more broadly. Not just fairy lovers, but any source of creative drive that demands too much. Social media platforms that keep artists producing content constantly. Publishing or music industries that demand endless output. The internalized voice that says you're only valuable if you're creating. These modern forces can drain artists just as effectively as any supernatural being. The shift from oral folklore to written literature to modern media shows how myths adapt and survive. Each new medium finds new ways to tell the old story, new contexts where the pattern remains recognizable and meaningful. The Leannán Sídhe isn't trapped in 19th century Ireland. She's wherever artists are burning themselves out in pursuit of their craft. Next, we'll examine the scientific and psychological research that illuminates why this myth resonates so deeply, why the pattern it describes appears so consistently in creative lives. We've seen the myth in its many forms. Now let's examine what modern science and psychology tell us about creativity, mental health, and why the Leannán Sídhe pattern appears so consistently in real lives. The connection between creativity and mental illness is one of the most researched topics in psychology. Let's explore three key findings: the prevalence of mood disorders in creative populations, the neurological basis of creative states, and the real costs of intense creative work. First, the statistics are striking. Studies consistently show that creative professionals, particularly writers and artists, have significantly higher rates of mood disorders than the general population. Research by Kay Redfield Jamieson, herself a psychologist who has bipolar disorder, found that poets have rates of bipolar disorder 10 to 20 times higher than the general population. Writers show elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Visual artists experience mood disorders at rates roughly twice the general population. This isn't just correlation. There appear to be genuine connections between the traits that make someone creative and the traits associated with mood disorders. Both involve heightened emotional sensitivity, the ability to make unusual connections between ideas, willingness to take risks, and intensity of experience. The same brain that can create beautiful art may also be vulnerable to debilitating depression or dangerous mania. Bipolar disorder in particular shows patterns eerily similar to the Leannán Sídhe curse. During manic or hypomanic phases, people experience increased energy, decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, and often dramatic increases in creativity and productivity. Many artists with bipolar disorder report that their best work happens during these elevated states. The ideas flow easily. The energy feels limitless. They can work for hours without fatigue. It feels like a gift, like touching something transcendent. But mania doesn't last. It crashes into depression, characterized by exhaustion, inability to create, loss of interest in everything, sometimes thoughts of death. The person burns bright and then crashes hard over and over. Even hypomanic states, which feel less dangerous because they're less extreme, can lead to exhaustion and eventual burnout. The pattern of inspired creation, followed by collapse, mirrors Leannán Sídhe's effect precisely. Now let's talk about the neurology of creative states. When people are in flow, when creativity is flowing easily, their brains show distinctive patterns. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and self-criticism, shows reduced activity. This is called transient hypofrontality. With the inner critic quieted, ideas flow more freely. Simultaneously, areas associated with reward and motivation show increased activity. Dopamine floods the system, creating feelings of pleasure and focus. This neurological state is genuinely addictive. The dopamine release creates a reward association. Your brain learns. Creative work equals pleasure. This motivates you to seek that state again, which can be healthy. But it can also lead to chasing the high, pushing yourself to create even when you're exhausted, even when it's damaging other aspects of your life. The brain's reward system doesn't necessarily distinguish between healthy dedication and destructive obsession. Creative flow also disrupts normal time perception. Hours pass like minutes. You forget to eat, forget to sleep, lose track of the external world. Again, this can be wonderful in the moment, but damaging over time. The person in the creative flow isn't taking care of basic physical needs. Extended periods of this neglect have real health consequences. Research on creative productivity shows interesting patterns. Many highly creative people produce their best work in bursts, periods of intense productivity, followed by exhaustion or depression. This isn't constant, steady output. It's punctuated, intensity followed by collapse. The bursts produce incredible work, but they take a genuine physical and mental toll. Studies of historical artists' lives reveal patterns consistent with the Leannán Sídhe myth. Many of the most celebrated artists in history struggled with mental illness, died young, or experienced periods of breakdown following intense creative productivity. Vincent van Gogh created most of his masterpieces in the final 2 years of his life, in a state of mental crisis, before dying at 37. Sylvia Plath wrote her greatest poems in the months before her suicide at 30. Dylan Thomas, Anne Sexton, John Berryman, the list goes on. Brilliant work, early death, the pattern repeating. Consider the modern phenomenon of burnout, now recognized by the World Health Organization as an occupational syndrome. Burnout results from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. Symptoms include exhaustion, mental distance from one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. Creative professionals are particularly vulnerable. The passion that drives them also makes them susceptible to overwork. They're more likely to ignore warning signs because the work feels important, meaningful, essential. The concept of the muse has psychological reality beyond metaphor. Many artists report experiencing their best ideas as coming from outside themselves, as being channeled rather than created. Neuroscience suggests this is the brain's way of experiencing its own subconscious processes. The creative insight that emerges suddenly feels external because it didn't come from conscious deliberation. Leannán Sídhe externalizes and personifies this experience. Sleep deprivation is another scientific parallel. Creative work often leads to poor sleep habits. Late nights working, difficulty shutting off the racing mind, anxiety about projects. Chronic sleep deprivation has severe health consequences. Weakened immune system, increased risk of heart disease, impaired cognitive function, mood disturbances. Artists who sacrifice sleep for work are literally trading years of life for creative productivity, exactly as the myth describes. The social isolation that often accompanies intense creative work has documented health impacts. Humans are social creatures. Prolonged isolation increases risk of depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, and even physical illness. Artists absorbed in their work often neglect relationships, become isolated, suffer the consequences. Leannán Sídhe's victims die alone, consumed by their solitary obsession. Modern research validates what folklore intuited. Creative drive can be genuinely dangerous. The traits that enable great art overlap significantly with traits that create vulnerability to mental illness. The states that facilitate creativity can become addictive and exhausting. The dedication required for mastery can shade into destructive obsession without clear boundaries. Here's what's remarkable. Folklore provided this understanding centuries before neuroscience existed. The Leannán Sídhe myth encoded psychological truth in supernatural narrative. It said, "This thing you value, this creative gift, has a dark side. It can consume you if you're not careful." Modern science uses different languages, but arrives at similar conclusions. The myth also provided something science struggles to offer: meaning and narrative. Saying, "I have bipolar disorder leading to creative mania and depressive crashes," is clinically accurate, but emotionally flat. Saying, "The Leannán Sídhe has me," carries weight, drama, a sense of being part of a larger story. Both describe the same experience. One is diagnosis, the other is mythology. Both have value. Next, we'll conclude by examining Leannán Sídhe's lasting legacy and what she continues to teach us about art, sacrifice, and the price of beauty. We've travelled from ancient Irish hills to modern neuroscience, from oral folklore to contemporary fantasy novels. Now, as we close, let's reflect on why Leannán Sídhe endures and what she continues to mean. Leannán Sídhe remains one of the most recognised figures in Irish fairy folklore. Mention her name to anyone familiar with Celtic mythology, and they'll know immediately: the fairy lover who inspires and destroys. Her image has staying power that other fairy beings lack. She's not just a curiosity for folklore enthusiasts. She's a living symbol that continues to resonate. Why does she persist when so many other folkloric figures have faded into obscurity? Let's consider 3 reasons: her psychological truth, her narrative power, and her continuing relevance. First, psychological truth. Leannán Sídhe describes a pattern that actually exists in the world. Artists do burn themselves out in pursuit of their craft. Creative drive can become destructive. Inspiration can demand too much. These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're real experiences that real people have. The myth survives because it names something genuine, something people recognize in their own lives or in the lives of artists they admire. She provides a framework for understanding experiences that are otherwise difficult to articulate. How do you explain the feeling of being consumed by your work, unable to stop even though you know you should? How do you describe the way inspiration can feel like possession, like something outside yourself has taken control? Leannán Sídhe gives you language. She gives you a story. She makes the inexplicable comprehensible through metaphor. Second, narrative power. Leannán Sídhe is a compelling story. A beautiful fairy offers an incredible gift with a terrible hidden price. It's got everything: supernatural beings, romance, tragedy, the cost of ambition. The narrative structure is elegant and complete. It raises profound questions without dictating answers. Is the trade worth it? Would you accept immortality through art in exchange for years of life? Different people will answer differently, and that ambiguity keeps the story interesting. The myth also functions at multiple levels. On the surface, it's a scary fairy tale about a dangerous supernatural being. One layer deeper, it's about creative obsession and its costs. Deeper still, it's about desire, sacrifice, and what we're willing to trade for what we value most. A myth that works at multiple levels of interpretation stays relevant longer than one with a single, simple meaning. Third, continuing relevance. If anything, the Leannán Sídhe is more relevant now than she was in the 19th century. Modern creative culture often glorifies overwork, celebrates the hustle, treats burnout as a badge of honor. Social media creates pressure for constant content creation. The creative economy demands endless productivity. Artists are expected to promote themselves constantly while also producing new work. The conditions that create Leannán Sídhe-like patterns are more prevalent than ever. The myth serves as a necessary warning. It says, "Be careful. This thing you love can destroy you. Your passion can become your prison. Inspiration without boundaries leads to exhaustion and collapse." These warnings are perhaps more urgent now than they were when people worked with their hands on farms and had natural limits built into their days. Academic discussions of the Leannán Sídhe continue in folklore studies, gender studies, psychology, and literature. Scholars analyze what she reveals about cultural attitudes toward women, creativity, mental illness, and sacrifice. She appears in papers, books, and conferences as a touchstone for discussions about the intersection of art and destruction. The gender dimension remains worth examining. The Leannán Sídhe is female, beautiful, and dangerous, reflecting cultural anxieties about female power and sexuality. But she's also outside patriarchal control, autonomous, making her own choices. She can be read as both misogynist trope and subversive figure. Modern feminist retellings sometimes reclaim her, presenting her story from her perspective, asking what she gains from these transactions, whether she's villain or victim or neither. The Leannán Sídhe represents the fundamental tension in Celtic storytelling between beauty and danger, between desire and death. Celtic mythology is full of this tension. The other world is beautiful, but you can't eat their food or you'll never leave. Fairy gold is real until morning when it turns to leaves. Nothing is ever quite what it seems. Beauty masks peril. Gifts come with strings attached. The Leannán Sídhe embodies this worldview perfectly. She demonstrates how folklore evolves. The myth started in oral tradition, serving specific social functions in Irish villages. It warned young artists. It explained patterns of behavior. It provided community understanding of difficult experiences. Then it moved into literature, becoming symbolic and self-aware. Now it exists in multiple forms simultaneously. Academic subject, fantasy trope, psychological metaphor, cultural touchstone. The myth adapts to survive, finding new contexts where its pattern remains meaningful. The enduring question at the heart of the Leannán Sídhe myth is this: what must be sacrificed for beauty or art? Celtic storytelling consistently asks this question in various forms. Heroes must give up comfort, safety, ordinary life. Lovers must choose between mortal happiness and immortal longing. Artists must decide how much of themselves to pour into their work. The question has no simple answer, which is precisely why it remains compelling. The Leannán Sídhe doesn't tell you what to choose. She simply makes a choice visible, makes you confront what you're trading and for what. Some artists, understanding the full price, would still make the deal, brief life, lasting art. Other artists would choose differently, valuing the life itself over the legacy. The myth respects both choices by making them explicit. In our modern world, where creativity is simultaneously celebrated and commodified, where artists are told to follow their passion while also paying their rent, where burnout is epidemic but rest is seen as weakness, the Leannán Sídhe remains urgently relevant. She's the personification of toxic creative culture, the voice that says more, better, never stop. But she's also the warning against that voice, the recognition that such demands are literally deadly. The myth survives because it holds truth, not factual truth about supernatural beings, but emotional and psychological truth about human experience. It names patterns we recognize. It validates experiences that are otherwise dismissed. It provides language for talking about complex, dangerous aspects of creative life. The Leannán Sídhe is more than a story told beside peat fires in 19th century Ireland. She's a living myth that continues to speak to contemporary concerns. She reminds us that our greatest gifts can become our greatest vulnerabilities. She warns that passion without boundaries becomes destruction. She asks us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice and whether the sacrifice is truly worth the reward. And perhaps most importantly, she gives artists permission to recognize when their work is consuming them, when inspiration has crossed from blessing to curse. By naming the pattern, by making it visible, the myth creates space for awareness and choice. You can recognize the Leannán Sídhe's embrace and decide whether to accept it or pull away. The story doesn't just describe the danger. It offers the possibility of resistance, of choosing life over legacy, of setting boundaries even with the things we love most. That's why she endures. That's why we keep telling her story. Because as long as people create art, as long as passion can become obsession, as long as inspiration demands sacrifice, we'll need the Leannán Sídhe to help us understand what's happening and why it matters.